everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you guys are new. Today's video is going to be a first impressions review and demo and some swatches of the newest mini palette from NATASHA DENONA. This is the mini Starlette palette. I feel like this has been really blowing up all over social media, so I was very excited to get it in the mail today and I wanted to go ahead and film a video with it. If you're not familiar with this palette, all 5 shades are already existing in NATASHA DENONA's other palettes, so they are in either the Star palette or the Lila palette. I don't have either one of those, so I was not too upset about it being repetitive or upset at all because it's nice that I get to have these in my collection. These little mini palettes from NATASHA DENONA retail for $27. I got mine at Sephora, and this is what the packaging looks like that it comes in. It's got a nice little like clear window so you can see the actual palette, but the palette is very small. I remember the first time I saw one of these in Sephora, I was so surprised at just how tiny these little palettes are because they're $27, which seems affordable in comparison to some of her other palettes, but the pans in this are quite small. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about picking up one of these palettes, especially if you've never seen one in person. They are really tiny. In comparison, this is it compared to the NATASHA DENONA Glam palette. So very, very tiny. This one has 15 shades in it. So even though it still has, 5 shades, it's definitely not the size of 1/3 of this palette even. But the midi palettes from NATASHA DENONA retail for about $69 now. So for $27, at least, you're not breaking the bank so much, but you're definitely losing out on some value per dollar there. And then because I feel like a lot of people are really familiar with the ColourPop 9-pan palettes, this is how the size would compare to one of the ColourPop 9-pan palettes. This is the That Taupe palette. So just to give you some size comparison, because this is, like I said, a very, very tiny palette. So that might take some getting used to. But that being said, it could be really nice for travel, and especially if you have a large eyeshadow collection like I do. I don't really hit pan on shades as much as I would like to, so I don't really mind that the pans are a little bit smaller, and I was really excited about this color story. Okay, so here's a closer look at the palette. I wanted to go ahead and show you guys the packaging of it, and then the shades, of course. So hopefully you guys can have a pretty good look of it here. The packaging itself is not really a magnetic closure or anything, and it also doesn't snap into place here. But what it does is it has like a little notch on the hinge almost, and so when you go to actually close it, it does kind of snap into place. So it's kind of, it's kind of a loud snap to it, but it does close pretty well. I will say though, be careful with this packaging because I did have one of their larger 5-pan palettes, and my packaging did break on that one a little bit. So even though it's really expensive, sometimes they can still break. So let's go ahead and jump into some swatches here. This is the first time that I'm swatching these two, so I was really excited to dig into these. But going left to right in the palette, we have first Nude Mauve, Galaxia, that one's really pretty, Vega, Rhea, and Per Se. So this palette definitely does not have a ton of depth. You can see I also didn't build up these swatches. I did not dip into any of the shades more than once, so I just wanted to kind of have a general swatch of them. This first shimmer shade called Galaxia is really pretty. I like the reflex in that. It almost has like a slight blue reflect in it that's very subtle, but I feel like it's still very wearable. If you have a deeper skin tone and you've tried this, let me know how that's worked out for you, because I do feel like NATASHA DENONA's shades can build up on each other. So I feel like these outer 2 shades probably could give you maybe like a medium level of depth, but there's definitely not any super deep shades in this palette. So definitely keep that in mind depending on your skin tone and your preferences, because that might kind of defer you away from the palette if you're not into that kind of a thing. But for me, I have really fair skin. I really don't like a ton of deep eyeshadows on the eyes, so this is right up my alley. For a 5-pan palette, I want to be able to use all 5 shades. Otherwise, it just feels like kind of a waste. So I'm excited about this, and I want to go ahead and create a look with it. The swatches to me are just kind of okay. I think it's more important on how they look on the eye, but all of the mattes felt very creamy and buttery, and I'm excited to play with the 2 shimmer shades. This inspiration photo on the listing on Sephora for this palette really inspired me to pick it up. So I want to actually try and kind of recreate a little bit of this type of a look. It looks like in that look, maybe they did not dip into the shade called Rhea, but because I'm reviewing this, I'm gonna try and dip into all of the shades because there's only 5. So I might end up putting that on like the lower lash line. I'm definitely realizing I should have washed my brushes before this, but we'll have to make do. Okay, I think I was able to find enough brushes that have not been used since I last washed them, so we'll get an accurate representation of how the colors look today. I did go ahead and bring my foundation, concealer, and powder onto the eyelids just to go ahead and have a blank canvas for testing out this palette. So I'm not going to worry about an eyeshadow primer. I'm going to start out with the shade called Vega, which is the lightest shade. And then I want to put this all in the crease. This is a nice light peachy kind of a shade. I will say though, I didn't pick up very much of it and it's already pretty pigmented. So I do find with NATASHA DENONA shadows that you really can build them up. And I don't have pan in many shadows from NATASHA DENONA. I actually only have pan in one of them. And I used that particular palette 65 times in 2021. My #1 spot I used 45 times this year. I think it was 65 times, it's somewhere right around there. And I used that lightest shade every single time. So that's really the only reason that I even have pan in that one. But to have used that palette at least 100 times now, I only have pan in one shadow. So if that doesn't tell you how pigmented those shadows are, I don't know what would, but they are pigmented. So even this shade, I'm finding that you really can kind of build it up just a little bit because it is so light. But at least on my skin tone, I mean, it is building up pretty nicely. I'm also going to run the shade on the lower lash line. There have been several of these little mini palettes from NATASHA DENONA that have really tempted me, but this was the first one that I actually pulled the trigger on because I just could not resist it. I really like the color story of this one. Okay, I want to go ahead and pick up a little bit of the shade called Nude Mauve, and I'm going to tap my brush off because I really want to be able to build this up in light layers. But I want to put this on the outer corner, and then I also want to put this like right on the inner portion with just what's left on the brush. I also want to drag this shade down kind of like where I might put a liquid liner and really pack this in and blend it out on the whole outer V of the eye. I'm really just putting a tiny little bit on the inner portion after I've put most of the pigment down on the outer corner. This is blending really nicely. I'm not surprised. I do find that Natasha's matte shades do blend really nicely, at least the ones that I've tried. So I had the Ayana palette, which was a larger 5-pan palette. I won that in a giveaway and I enjoyed it for a really long time, but then I felt like I wasn't reaching for it enough. So I passed it on to a friend that I felt like would get a lot of use out of it. And then the 2 that I already had in my collection before I got this newest one were the Glam palette and the My Dream palette. The Glam palette was my favorite in 2020 or 2021? I can't remember. Whatever year I filmed the first, how many times I actually used my eyeshadow palettes, I used it 65 times that year. So I definitely used it a lot then. And then the My Dream palette I do find can crease on me a little bit, but I don't notice that with the Glam palette. When I'm filming this, it is already nighttime and I plan to post this video today. So after I've worn this palette some more, I will try to come back to this video and update you guys in a pinned comment whether I notice any creasing on this one, but I'm really hoping that I don't notice any. Okay, with a smaller kind of pencil brush, I'm gonna pick up the shade Per Se. I'm also gonna tap that off just to hopefully not get any fallout. And I wanna build this up on the very outer corner, kind of like a smaller V shape than the last shade. I also want to bring this shade on the inner portion too, but I might need to use a smaller brush. I do kind of have smaller eyes. With that last brush I was using, I'm just going to go ahead and blend around that purple shade. And I'm going to pick up a little bit more of Nude Mauve, the shade on the very left. Just make sure I blended out the purple really nicely. Also kind of want to blow this out a little bit and make a little bit more of an exaggerated V shape. With that first brush I used, I'm going to pick up a little bit more of the shade Vega, and then again, just make sure that I'm blending it really well. I really wanted to take my time and blend these shades because I wanted to see if they stand up to the quality that I'm used to seeing from this brand. And so far so good. I am noticing that. There's a little bit of patching kind of right here, but that's kind of typical, and my skin has been a little bit dry lately, so I don't want to blame that on the shadow, especially since I think that it is blending really nicely on the other eye. But if anything, I think when I added that last shade, the purple one, it did get just slightly patchy on that portion of my eye, but I'm really not surprised by that. But because I'm having that problem, I do want to kind of work with it and see if I can remedy it. So I'm just going to kind of go back and forth building up the shades, and we'll see how that works out. With a really small pencil brush, I'm also going to pick up a little bit more of the shade Per Se, and I'm going to start to put that on the inner portion of the crease like the photo that I'm kind of referencing. Just am curious to see how this looks on me. Okay, I was actually loving how I was looking on this eye, and then I realized that I must have used this brush for an inner corner highlight at some point because it is a little bit like sparkly and lighter than when I did it on the left eye. So this eye is actually what it would look like. This one is a little bit too sparkly. So I don't know, I actually kind of like it better with this one, but I was just kind of curious to see how that would turn out looking, but I think I'll try and build it up some. I do really like this shade. It's like a really nice sort of dusty purple. And then I think with the same brush and the same color, I really want to build up a little bit more depth here on the outer corner. I want to see how deep I could build that shade. I don't know, I actually feel like this builds up depth really nicely. I wouldn't really feel the need for a deeper shade than this, but again, I do recognize that I have very fair skin, so you know, that could be a very different experience for you, even if your skin is just a little bit deeper than mine, because I know that colors can look very different on everyone. So far, so good. I'm actually really liking this. Again, with that very first brush, I'm not picking up anything extra, but I'm just kind of blending out this outer line here because I brought the purple down a little bit too low. Now that I've kind of kept working on the look too, I don't think it's quite as patchy. So I do think that if you do struggle with patching, that NATASHA Denona in general has a really good formula for kind of combating patchiness. In my experience, you just have to kind of build up the shades. If you find that you're having more patching, try to pick up light layers of the shadow and tap your brush off because it will get rid of some extra pigment and make it easier to build it versus starting out with too much pigment and then you're trying to blend it. And I find that for me, over blending leads to patching a lot of times. All right, with that tiny little crease brush, I'm gonna pick up some of this shimmer shade called Galaxia, very, very lightly. I'm just gonna try and even out my mistake here on the purple shade because I didn't mean to have one of them be a little glittery, but that's okay. Okay, I can't quite tell what shade she has all over the lid. I can't tell whether she has just Galaxia or I'm kind of thinking maybe she has a little bit of Rhea and then Galaxia on top. So looking at the swatches, I don't think she's got just Rhea, so I might try and swatch a little bit of Rhea and then put Galaxia over it. I'm trying to see what she's got on the lid because I really like how hers looks. So here's Rhea and then let's add Galaxia on top. I don't know, I feel like hers looks lighter. I'm gonna put Galaxia all over the lid because I just wanna see how it looks on its own. And I'm just going to use my finger for this. I'm also not gonna use any of my NYX glitter glue. You guys know that I pretty much always use that under a shimmer shade, but I want to see how these apply on their own. Oh yeah, that is so pretty. I really like that. I really like that shade. Okay, I'm glad I didn't put it on top of the other one. I'll put the other shimmer shade on the lower lash line so we can see it, but this Galaxia shade is gorgeous. I feel like if you sprayed this with a setting spray too before you applied it, it would be even more shimmery. But I'm also bringing this on top of where I put that purple on the inner portion of the crease, and then I'm pulling this up everywhere. I'm putting this almost all the way up to the eyebrow, just cause, I don't know. I really like that shade. But I do really like the little hint of purple on the inner portion of the crease. You guys will have to let me know what you think about that. Okay, and then because I want to use all of the shades, I'm going to go ahead, like I said, and put the shade Rhea on the lower lash line. And for that, I'm actually going to use a brush. This is a pretty densely packed flat brush, so I think that it should apply it pretty nicely on the lower lash line. Well, that shade's actually really pretty. It's kind of like a copper shade. I feel like it really would make your eyes stand out if you put that all over the lid especially, but I really like that. I've got to stop holding stuff in front of my face. Actually, yesterday I posted the 2 looks with the Sydney Grace Unbreakable Bond palette, and I was so upset watching it back because I was holding the palette and using it as the mirror, and I've started to film on the back camera of my phone, and I feel like the quality is a lot better, but there's definitely a learning curve because the focus on it is very intense. So it kept focusing on the palette, so I gotta make sure you guys can actually see what I'm doing. It also really shows my skin, so I had to scrap a whole foundation video. I'm gonna refilm it probably this weekend, but I had to scrap the video that I made on the Revlon foundation, so that video is still coming. I know I mentioned that. It did not work out. I've got to refilm it. It's one thing to have a talk through video or something where the video is kind of questionable if the lighting is off or something, or it's like hyper focused on something, but for a foundation video, I really need it to be pretty crisp and clear on my skin. So I'll refilm that so you guys can get a better look at how the foundation actually looks, but that'll come at a later date. Okay, so I'm finding that when I put that shade on the lower lash line, it almost just looks like a matte shade or maybe like a satin shade. So I want to try and pick it up with a brush and then spray my brush with a setting spray. The one that I've got next to me here is the e.l.f. Dewy Coconut. So I'm just going to spray that a little bit, and then I'm going to add that again on the lower lash line. Okay, yeah, that's a lot better. I'm gonna not hold the mirror in front of y'all. All right, and then the last thing I want to do to finish out this look is just pick up a little bit more of the shade Galaxia on a brush. I'm gonna spray this one too, and then I want to try and use this as my inner corner highlight. Not quite what I was going for, but I think it works. I just really like to have an inner corner highlight shade in the palette that I'm using, but it's not the end of the world. Yeah, I think that works, and it's still pretty. I gotta say, I really like this look. And I've heard some feedback. I have seen a couple of review videos on this that a lot of people seem to say that on all of the 5-pan palettes, and this one included, that all your looks are gonna look the same. And like to a certain extent, yes, because there's only 5 shades, but I do feel like you could get a pretty good variety of looks with this palette because I don't think that any of the shades are repetitive. You know, you could argue that you might want a darker shade or a lighter shade, but you know, that's not really like what this palette is meant for. And I do think that she has a lot of options. And if this isn't the color story that you're after, then you might not want to pick this one up. But as far as like what the color story is and not wanting to make it a different palette, I think that it is pretty well rounded. I'm just adding some of the Tower 28 mascara. I really like this mascara. I fell for the hype and I bought it and I do not regret it. It's been so good. Okay, so here's the finished look. I really like it. I'm obsessed with how the shimmer shade's looking all over the lid, and I feel like it's very reflective and just very pretty. So I'm really happy with that. I do feel like you could honestly just create a couple different looks with this one. I don't feel like it's just limited to one look. I've got a quad from Charlotte Tilbury that I always just create the same look with it. And this one honestly kind of reminds me of it, the Pillow Talk quad. Let me show you guys that one. That might be an interesting shade comparison. Yeah, some of these are actually really similar. They're different enough, but I think that's interesting. So this is the Pillow Talk quad from Charlotte Tilbury, and I do feel like they are favoring shades. I don't think that any of them are probably exactly the same, but I would bet that this lightest peach shade and even this pink one, I think this one's called Pillow Talk, they probably don't look that different on the eyes. So here is the NATASHA Denona Vega and then Charlotte Tilbury Pillow Talk. They are different, but as far as like when you're creating a look, I feel like they'd be similar enough. And then, I haven't learned the names of this one yet, Nude Mauve from NATASHA Denona, which I'm holding them upside down, so sorry. It's easier to hold them that way, but that one in comparison to shade 3 called Smoke from Charlotte Tilbury are also pretty similar there. So I feel like you'd get a pretty similar look with this, but I feel like adding that purple there on the end really does give you some difference in the palette. And then I feel like the two shimmer shades in this one are pretty close together. And then at least in the NATASHA Denona palette, the shimmer shades are different enough. So I feel like that's the closest palette in my own collection that really compares to this one. And of course, this one is a lot cheaper actually than the quad from Charlotte Tilbury, and it has an extra shade. So I would give this my thumbs up. If you're looking at picking this up and you think that you would enjoy the color story, I think you'd like it. I don't have anything negative to say about it. I would just caution you to be careful with this packaging because I know that my Iona palette did break. So while I feel like it looks really sleek and it does feel pretty good quality, I just know that I need to be careful, at least on my own, with the hinges there. So I don't know. Maybe the packaging's even better on this one than it was on the Iona palette. I don't know. If mine breaks, I'll keep you guys posted. But yeah, I do really enjoy this so far. So here's one last look at the palette for you guys. Hope that you guys enjoyed to see my first impressions review, demo, and swatches of this palette. Let me know down below what you think of this one. If you did enjoy today's video, please go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more content from me. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.